poor rancher, was forced to marry a fat stranger for 20 acres. That night shocked the whole town. You're about to witness one of the most extraordinary stories from the Old West, where desperation, prejudice, and unexpected courage collided in ways that would change an entire community forever. If you're ready to discover how one night transformed not just two strangers, but an entire town's understanding of what it means to be human, then hit that like button right now, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. Now let's step back to 1885, to a dusty cattle town in Texas called Millbrook, where the scorching sun was about to witness something no one would ever forget. Chapter 1. The Desperate Deal. The October sun blazed mercilessly over Millbrook, Texas, casting long shadows across the parched earth that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Thomas "Tom" Sullivan wiped the sweat from his brow as he stared at the foreclosure notice nailed to his ranch gate, the harsh reality of his situation settling in his chest like a lead weight. At 26, he had already buried his parents, lost most of his cattle to disease, and watched his dreams crumble like the dried mud beneath his worn boots. The Lazy S Ranch had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations, but now it stood on the precipice of extinction. Tom's calloused hands trembled as he read the notice again, the words blurring through his exhaustion. Final notice. Payment due in full by November 1st, 1885, or property will be seized. Damn it all to hell, he muttered, kicking at a loose stone that skittered across the dusty path leading to his modest wooden homestead. The house, once painted white, now bore the weathered grey of neglect and poverty. Its shutters hung askew, and several roof shingles lay scattered in the yard, casualties of the last fierce storm that had torn through the county. As Tom walked toward the house, his bay gelding, Rusty, whinnied from the corral, one of only 3 horses left from what had once been a thriving operation. The sight of his faithful companion reminded him of better days, when his father would return from cattle drives with pockets full of silver dollars and stories of adventure on the trail. Inside the house, Tom slumped into his father's old leather chair, its springs groaning under his weight. The furniture was sparse, a table his grandfather had built by hand, 2 mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace that had provided warmth through countless harsh winters. On the mantel sat a daguerreotype of his parents on their wedding day, their faces frozen in sepia-toned happiness that now seemed like a lifetime ago. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Tom opened it to find Jeremiah Fletcher, the town's banker and one of its most influential citizens. Fletcher was a portly man in his 50s, always impeccably dressed despite the frontier setting, with a gold watch chain draped across his vest and a perpetually calculating expression. "Tom," Fletcher said, removing his bowler hat and wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief, "might I come in? I believe we have some business to discuss." Tom stepped aside reluctantly, gesturing for Fletcher to take a seat. The banker's presence filled the small room with an air of formality that felt out of place among the humble furnishings. "I'll be direct, son," Fletcher began, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from Tom. "I know about your financial difficulties. The bank holds your note, after all. But I might have a solution that could benefit us both." Tom leaned forward, desperate hope flickering in his chest. "I'm listening." Fletcher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I have a business associate arriving tomorrow from back east, a woman of substantial means. She's looking to establish herself out here, away from the complications of city life. The thing is, she requires a husband to make such a venture respectable." "What's that got to do with me?" Tom asked, though he was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "Marry her, Tom. In exchange, she'll pay off your debts and deed you 20 acres of prime grazing land adjacent to your current property. It's enough to give you a fresh start." Tom stared at Fletcher, his mind reeling. "You're talking about marrying a complete stranger. What kind of woman?" The kind who values practical arrangements over romantic nonsense, Fletcher interrupted. Look, son, I won't sugarcoat it. She's not what most men would call conventionally attractive. But she's got money, she's got sense, and she's got a proposition that could save your ranch. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of cattle lowing in a neighbor's pasture. Tom thought of his parents' photograph on the mantel, of the love that had built this place, and felt something inside him wither. "What's her name?" he asked finally. "Margaret Hartwell. She'll arrive on tomorrow's afternoon train." The wedding would take place the following evening, assuming you agree, of course. Tom stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land that represented everything his family had worked for. The rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees, the creek that meandered through the lower pasture, the graves of his parents beneath the old oak tree. It was all about to slip away, unless he made this deal with the devil. "And if I refuse?" Fletcher replaced his hat and stood to leave. "Then you'll be off this land by the 1st of November, and Miss Hartwell will find another arrangement. I have 3 other ranchers in mind who might be more amenable to practical considerations." After Fletcher left, Tom sank back into his father's chair and buried his face in his hands. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He could hear his father's voice echoing from childhood. "A man's word and his land are all he's got in this world, son. Protect both with your life." But what happened when protecting one meant sacrificing the other? As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Tom made his decision. He would meet this Margaret Hartwell. He would marry her if necessary, and he would find a way to honor both his family's legacy and whatever bargain he was about to make. That night, as he lay in his narrow bed listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. If only he knew just how right he was, and if only he knew what Margaret Hartwell would bring to his quiet corner of Texas. Secrets that would soon have the entire town talking and change everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and the true meaning of love. But that's a story for tomorrow, when the afternoon train would pull into Millbrook Station carrying a woman who would prove that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships can lead to the most extraordinary transformations. The morning of October 15th dawned clear and bright, with just a hint of autumn's approach in the crisp air. Tom spent the early hours tending to his remaining livestock and trying to calm his nerves. By noon, he had bathed, shaved, and put on his best shirt, a blue cotton work shirt that his mother had sewn for him years ago, now patched but clean. As he prepared to ride into town, Tom caught his reflection in the cracked mirror above his wash basin. At 26, he was tall and lean, with dark hair that perpetually fell across his forehead and brown eyes that had seen too much hardship for his age. His hands were scarred from years of ranch work, and his face was weathered by the Texas sun. But there was still a fundamental decency in his expression that his trials hadn't managed to erode. The ride into Millbrook took 20 minutes, and Tom used every second to steel himself for what lay ahead. The town was typical of countless others scattered across the frontier, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, their false fronts giving an illusion of grandeur to what were essentially functional structures designed to serve the needs of ranchers, farmers, and the occasional traveler. The Millbrook Hotel stood at the center of town, a 2-story building that served as both lodging and the closest thing the community had to a social center. Its wraparound porch was usually occupied by local men whittling, playing checkers, or discussing the weather and cattle prices. Today, however, the porch was notably empty, a sign that word of the unusual arrangement had already begun to spread through the tight-knit community. Tom tied Rusty to the hitching post outside Fletcher's bank and took a deep breath before pushing through the heavy wooden door. The interior was cool and dim, with dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the windows. Fletcher sat behind his large oak desk, but he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman who made Tom stop short in the doorway. Margaret Hartwell was indeed a large woman, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, with greying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She wore a dark blue travelling dress that, while well made, couldn't disguise her substantial frame. But what struck Tom most wasn't her size. It was the way she sat, with perfect posture and an air of quiet dignity that commanded respect. "Ah, Tom," Fletcher said, rising from his chair, "allow me to introduce Miss Margaret Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, this is Thomas Sullivan." Margaret stood with surprising grace for a woman of her size and extended her hand. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of the East Coast, "Mr. Fletcher has explained the nature of your situation. I trust he has been equally forthcoming about mine." Tom found himself unexpectedly impressed by her straightforward manner. There was no pretense, no attempt to charm or manipulate, just honest assessment from one practical person to another. "Yes, ma'am, he has," Tom replied. "I appreciate your directness." "Good," Margaret said, settling back into her chair. "Then we can dispense with pleasantries and discuss the terms of our arrangement. I require a husband to establish myself respectably in this territory. You require financial assistance to maintain your property. It seems we have complementary needs." For the next hour, they discussed the practical aspects of their arrangement with the same matter-of-fact tone they might have used to negotiate the purchase of livestock. Margaret would pay off Tom's debts, provide him with the deed to 20 additional acres, and supply enough capital to restock his ranch with cattle. In exchange, Tom would provide her with his name, his protection, and a place in the community. "I want to be clear about one thing," Margaret said, as their discussion drew to a close. "I don't expect love, Mr. Sullivan. I don't expect romance or passionate declarations. What I do expect is respect, honesty, and a genuine partnership in building something worthwhile together. Can you provide those things?" Tom studied her face, seeing intelligence, determination, and something else, a kind of wounded pride that he recognized from his own mirror. This woman had been hurt, probably repeatedly, and had decided that practical arrangements were safer than emotional vulnerability. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe I can." "Then we have an agreement. The wedding will take place tomorrow evening at the church. I've already spoken with Reverend Matthews." As they shook hands to seal their bargain, Tom felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He had saved his ranch, but at what cost? And what secrets lay behind Margaret Hartwell's composed exterior? Tomorrow evening would bring answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask, and the entire town of Millbrook was about to witness something that would challenge every assumption they had about this quiet, practical woman from the East. Chapter 2. The Wedding That Stunned Everyone. The following evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the Texas weather itself was holding its breath for the unusual ceremony about to take place. The Millbrook Community Church, a modest wooden structure with a simple bell tower, had never seen a gathering quite like this one. Word of the hastily arranged marriage had spread through town like wildfire, and curiosity had drawn nearly every resident to witness the spectacle. Tom stood at the altar in his best suit, a black wool outfit that had belonged to his father, trying to ignore the whispered conversations and barely concealed stares from the pews behind him. Reverend Matthews, a kind man in his 60s with a snow-white beard, stood beside him with his worn Bible, occasionally offering reassuring pats on Tom's shoulder. The church buzzed with the kind of excited energy usually reserved for county fairs or 4th of July celebrations. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had positioned herself in the front row for the best possible view, while the Jameson brothers, local ranchers known for their crude sense of humor, snickered in the back corner. Even Dr. Morgan, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens, had made an appearance. his usually stern expression softened by what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Never seen the church this full on a weeknight?" Reverend Matthews murmured to Tom. "Folks are mighty interested in this union of yours." Tom nodded, his collar feeling uncomfortably tight. Through the open windows, he could hear more people gathering outside, those who hadn't been able to secure seats inside, but were determined not to miss the show. The whole situation felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. At exactly 7 o'clock, the church door opened, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Margaret Hartwell entered with the same quiet dignity she had displayed in Fletcher's office, wearing a dress of deep burgundy silk that, while clearly expensive, did nothing to minimize her considerable size. She walked down the aisle alone, her head held high, seemingly oblivious to the stares and whispered comments that followed in her wake. What struck Tom most forcefully was her composure. Here was a woman who undoubtedly knew exactly what the townspeople were thinking, what they were saying about her, and yet she moved with the grace of a queen entering her own court. There was something almost regal about her bearing that made the crude whispers and snide glances seem petty and small by comparison. Behind her walked Fletcher, serving as her escort, and behind him came an unexpected figure, an elderly black woman dressed in simple but clean clothes, carrying a small leather satchel. Tom had never seen her before, and her presence added another layer of intrigue to an already unusual evening. As Margaret reached the altar, she turned to face Tom, and for the first time he saw something vulnerable flash across her features, just for an instant, so quickly that he might have imagined it. Then the mask of composure returned, and she nodded to him with the same businesslike efficiency she had shown during their negotiations. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and began the ceremony, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas James Sullivan and Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell in holy matrimony." As the familiar words washed over him, Tom found himself studying his bride's face. Up close, he could see that she was probably younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 32 or 33, and that her features, while heavy, were actually quite pleasant. Her eyes, behind those wire-rimmed spectacles, held an intelligence and depth that spoke of education and experience far beyond what most frontier women possessed. The ceremony proceeded without incident until Reverend Matthews reached the traditional vows. "Do you, Thomas James Sullivan, take Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Tom's voice was steady as he answered, "I do." "And do you, Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell, take Thomas James Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Margaret's response surprised everyone in the church, including Tom. Instead of the simple "I do" they expected, she spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the building. "I do," with the understanding that marriage is a partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I bring to this union not just my commitment, but my skills, my resources, and my determination to build something meaningful together." A ripple of murmurs ran through the congregation. This wasn't the submissive acceptance they had expected from any bride, much less one in Margaret's position. Even Reverend Matthews looked momentarily taken aback, before recovering his composure and continuing with the ceremony. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Tom, you may kiss your bride." This moment had been the source of Tom's greatest anxiety, but as he leaned toward Margaret, she whispered something that only he could hear. "Make it look convincing. Give them something to remember." Tom was puzzled by her words, but he did as she asked, taking her face gently in his hands and kissing her with more tenderness than either of them had expected. When they separated, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before: surprise, and perhaps a hint of gratitude. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers, though whether they were celebrating the union or simply relieved that the spectacle was over, Tom couldn't tell. As he and Margaret turned to face their audience as husband and wife, he noticed that the elderly black woman who had followed them into the church was smiling broadly, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Who's that woman?" Tom whispered to Margaret as they began their walk back down the aisle. "Someone very important," Margaret replied quietly. "You'll understand soon enough." The reception, such as it was, took place in the church's fellowship hall. Mrs. Henderson had organized the ladies of the town to provide refreshments, and long tables groaned under the weight of homemade pies, cornbread, and pitchers of sweet tea. The atmosphere was festive, though Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he and Margaret were specimens in a zoo, being observed and discussed by visitors who found them curious but ultimately alien. Fletcher made a toast, raising his glass of punch and declaring, "To Tom and Margaret Sullivan, may their union be prosperous and their partnership endure." The crowd echoed the toast, though Tom detected more curiosity than genuine good wishes in their voices. As the evening wore on, Tom found himself impressed by Margaret's social skills. She moved through the crowd with ease, engaging the women in conversations about recipes and household management, discussing business matters with the men, and somehow managing to win over even the most skeptical attendees. Mrs. Henderson, who had been notably cool toward Margaret before the ceremony, was soon laughing at something his new wife had said about the challenges of keeping house in frontier conditions. But it was Margaret's interaction with the children present that truly surprised Tom. Little Sarah Morrison, the blacksmith's 6-year-old daughter, had been staring wide-eyed at Margaret throughout the reception. Instead of being offended or embarrassed, Margaret knelt down to the child's level and engaged her in conversation about her doll, speaking to her with the same respect she showed the adults. "She's pretty," Sarah announced loudly, causing her mother to flush with embarrassment and move to silence her. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret said gently, straightening Sarah's hair ribbon. "You're quite beautiful yourself, and very polite." The exchange seemed to break some invisible barrier, and soon Margaret was surrounded by children, all clamoring for her attention. Tom watched from across the room, beginning to realize that his new wife was far more complex than their business arrangement had led him to believe. As the reception wound down and the guests began to drift away, Tom found himself facing the reality of what came next. He and Margaret would return to his ranch, to his small house, and somehow figure out how to live together as husband and wife. The practical aspects of their arrangement seemed much more complicated now that they were actually married. The elderly black woman who had followed Margaret into the church approached them as they prepared to leave. Up close, Tom could see that she was probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that held a lifetime of wisdom and experience. "Mr. Sullivan," Margaret said, "I'd like you to meet Esther Washington. She raised me after my parents died. She's come with me from Boston to help us get settled." Tom extended his hand to Esther, who shook it warmly. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Washington." "The pleasure's mine, Mr. Sullivan," Esther replied, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of origins far from Boston. "I've heard good things about you, and I can see why Miss Margaret, Mrs. Sullivan now, felt you were the right choice." As they prepared to leave the church, Fletcher pulled Tom aside for a final word. "The papers are all prepared," he said, handing Tom an envelope. "Deed to the 20 acres, receipt showing your debts are paid in full, and a bank draft for operating capital. Your bride has kept her part of the bargain most generously." Tom tucked the envelope inside his jacket, still hardly able to believe that his financial troubles were truly over. But as he helped Margaret into the wagon he had borrowed from a neighbor for the occasion, he realized that his real challenges were just beginning. He was now married to a woman he barely knew, who had already proven herself to be far more complicated and interesting than he had anticipated. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, with Margaret sitting beside him on the wagon seat and Esther in the back, with Margaret's substantial collection of luggage. The October night was clear and cool, with a canopy of stars stretching endlessly overhead. Tom found himself acutely aware of Margaret's presence beside him, the rustle of her silk dress, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her clothing. "It's beautiful out here," Margaret said softly, breaking the silence. "I'd forgotten how brilliant the stars could be, away from city lights." "You've lived in the country before?" Tom asked. "Long ago," she replied, but didn't elaborate. As they turned into the lane leading to the Sullivan Ranch, Tom felt a mixture of apprehension and curiosity about what the night would bring. Margaret had made it clear that she didn't expect romance, but they were now husband and wife, and there were certain expectations and proprieties to consider. More importantly, he was beginning to suspect that there was far more to Margaret Hartwell Sullivan than met the eye. The house looked smaller and shabbier than ever in the moonlight, and Tom felt a stab of embarrassment at bringing his educated, refined wife to such humble accommodations. But Margaret surveyed the property with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than disappointment. "It has good bones," she said, stepping down from the wagon with Tom's assistance. "With some work, it could be quite charming." As Tom helped Esther unload the luggage, he caught the older woman watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was approval in her gaze, but also something else. Anticipation, as if she was waiting for something specific to happen. Inside the house, Tom lit several oil lamps while Margaret and Esther looked around the simple rooms. He had cleaned as thoroughly as possible, but there was no disguising the fact that this was a bachelor's dwelling, furnished with only the bare necessities. "The bedroom is through there," Tom said awkwardly, gesturing toward the room where his parents had slept. "I can make up a bed for myself in the front room, if you'd prefer." "That won't be necessary," Margaret said firmly. "We're married, Mr. Sullivan. Whatever our personal arrangements, we must maintain appearances. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I don't snore, and I suspect you're too much of a gentleman to make our situation any more awkward than it needs to be." Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks at her directness, but he had to admire her practical approach to their unusual circumstances. "I'll make us some coffee," Esther announced, bustling toward the kitchen. "You two must be tired after such an eventful day." As Esther disappeared into the kitchen, Tom and Margaret found themselves alone together for the first time since their wedding ceremony. The weight of their new relationship hung in the air between them, filled with unspoken questions and unexplored possibilities. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, "for agreeing to this arrangement. I know it wasn't easy for you." "Thank you for making it possible," Tom replied. "I meant what I said about respect and partnership. I don't know much about being a husband, especially under these circumstances, but I'll do my best to be fair to you." Margaret smiled, and Tom realized it was the first completely genuine expression he had seen from her. It transformed her face, revealing warmth and humor that her composed exterior had hidden. "I think we'll manage just fine, Mr. Sullivan. After all, we're both practical people who understand the value of hard work and honest dealing. That's more than many marriages start with." As they prepared for their first night as husband and wife, neither Tom nor Margaret could have imagined the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The quiet, practical arrangement they had made was about to be tested in ways they never could have anticipated, and the entire town of Millbrook was about to discover that Margaret Hartwell Sullivan was harboring secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about courage, justice, and the true meaning of standing up for what's right. Chapter 3. The Night That Changed Everything. The clock on the mantel chimed 11 times as Tom finished banking the fire in the stone fireplace. Margaret had retired to the bedroom an hour earlier, and Esther had settled herself on a makeshift bed in the small room that had once served as Tom's mother's sewing room. The house was quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of settling wood and the distant call of night birds. Tom sat in his father's chair, staring into the dying embers and trying to process the surreal events of the day. He was now a married man. His financial troubles were over, and his ranch was secure. Yet nothing felt quite real. The practical arrangement he had entered into was proving more complex than he had anticipated, primarily because Margaret herself was far more intriguing than he had expected. A soft knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Tom frowned, checking the mantel clock again. Who would be calling at this hour? He opened the door to find Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison standing on his porch, hat in hand, and a worried expression on his weathered face. "Tom," Morrison said quietly, "sorry to bother you so late, especially on your wedding night, but I need to speak with your wife. It's urgent." "My wife?" Tom was puzzled. What could you possibly need with Margaret? She just arrived in town yesterday. Morrison glanced around nervously, as if he expected to be overheard, despite the isolated location of the ranch. "Look, I can't explain everything right now, but there are some men in town asking questions about her. Federal marshals, Tom. They rode in about an hour after your wedding ended." Before Tom could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway behind him, fully dressed despite the late hour. She had obviously been listening to their conversation. "How many?" she asked Morrison directly, her voice calm and businesslike. "3," Morrison replied. "They're staying at the hotel tonight, but they've been asking a lot of questions about a Margaret Hartwell from Boston. They seemed real interested when folks told them about the wedding." Margaret nodded, as if this news was not entirely unexpected. "Thank you for the warning, Deputy. I appreciate your discretion." "Ma'am," Morrison touched his hat brim respectfully, "I don't know what this is about, but you seem like good people. Just be careful." After Morrison left, Tom turned to Margaret, his mind racing with questions and growing concern. "Margaret, what's going on? Why would federal marshals be looking for you?" Instead of answering immediately, Margaret walked to the window and peered through the curtains at the dark landscape beyond. Her composed demeanor had shifted slightly, revealing an underlying tension that told Tom this situation was more serious than he had realized. "Tom," she said finally, turning to face him, "I need to tell you some things about my past. Things I should have mentioned before we married, but I hoped they wouldn't follow me here." Before she could continue, Esther emerged from her room, also fully dressed and carrying her leather satchel. The older woman's expression was grim, and she moved with the purposeful urgency of someone preparing for trouble. "They found us," Esther said simply. It wasn't a question. "It appears so," Margaret replied. "Deputy Morrison says 3 federal marshals arrived after the wedding." Tom looked back and forth between the two women, his confusion growing by the moment. "Will someone please tell me what's happening? Margaret, are you in some kind of trouble with the law?" Margaret sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, removing her spectacles and rubbing her eyes wearily. When she looked up at Tom, he saw a vulnerability in her expression that she had kept carefully hidden until now. "Tom, my full name is Margaret Elizabeth Hartwell Richardson. In Boston, I was married to Cornelius Richardson, one of the city's most prominent businessmen and philanthropists. What the public didn't know was that Cornelius was also one of its most brutal and sadistic men." Tom felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet. "You're already married?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm a widow. Cornelius died 6 months ago, but the circumstances of his death, they're complicated." Esther moved to stand beside Margaret's chair, her weathered hand resting protectively on the younger woman's shoulder. "Miss Margaret was defending herself," she said quietly. "That man was a monster, Mr. Sullivan. He hurt her for years in ways no woman should ever be hurt." The pieces began clicking together in Tom's mind, and he felt a cold anger building in his chest. "He beat you, among other things," Margaret said quietly. "Cornelius was very careful to maintain his public image. To the outside world, he was a pillar of the community, generous with charities, active in the church, respected in business. Behind closed doors, he was different. Tom sank into his father's chair, struggling to process this revelation. What happened 6 months ago? Margaret was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He came home drunk one night, angrier than I'd ever seen him. He'd lost a significant amount of money in some business deal, and he blamed me somehow. He started hitting me, but this time was different. This time, I knew he was going to kill me. Esther's grip on Margaret's shoulder tightened. Tell him about the knife, Miss Margaret. Cornelius had a letter opener on his desk, a decorative thing with a sharp blade. When he came at me again, I grabbed it. I didn't mean to. I only wanted to make him stop. But when he lunged at me, Margaret's voice trailed off. You defended yourself, Tom said quietly. Any reasonable person would have done the same thing. That's not how Cornelius's family sees it, Margaret replied bitterly. The Richardsons are one of Boston's oldest families. They have connections everywhere, judges, politicians, law enforcement. When Cornelius died, they made sure the story was told their way. According to them, I murdered their beloved son and brother for his money. Ooh, but surely the evidence, Tom began. Evidence can be interpreted many ways when you have enough influence, Esther interrupted. The Richardsons painted Miss Margaret as a gold-digging murderess who killed her husband in cold blood. They had her charged with first-degree murder. Tom felt his anger growing. That's insane. If he was beating you, a woman's word against a dead man's reputation, Margaret said with bitter humor. Especially when that man's family controls half the judges in Massachusetts. My attorney advised me that I had virtually no chance of acquittal, regardless of the truth. So you ran, Tom said, understanding beginning to dawn. Esther helped me escape before the trial. We've been moving west ever since, staying ahead of the bounty hunters and federal marshals. I hoped that by marrying and taking a new name in a territory where the Richardson influence didn't reach, I could finally be safe. Tom stood and began pacing the small room, his mind racing. But they tracked you here. How? Money leaves a trail, Esther said grimly. Miss Margaret had to access her accounts to pay your debts and buy the land. They must have been watching for any significant transactions. A new thought occurred to Tom, and he stopped pacing. Margaret, when you paid off my debts, that money wasn't yours, was it? It was your husband's. Legally, it became mine when he died, Margaret said defensively. I was his wife, but his family is claiming I have no right to inherit anything, given the circumstances of his death. So now they can add theft to the murder charge, Tom said grimly. The three of them sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the situation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry seeming to echo the desperation they all felt. What do we do now? Tom asked finally. We run, Margaret said simply. Esther and I have gotten good at disappearing. We can be gone before dawn. No, Tom said firmly. You're my wife now. We'll face this together. Margaret stared at him in surprise. Tom, you don't understand. If you help me, you become an accessory. You could be charged with harboring a fugitive. You could lose everything. I could lose everything again anyway, Tom replied. If they arrest you, they'll seize any assets you use to pay my debts. I'll be right back where I started, except now I'll also be known as the man who married a murderer for money. I'm not a murderess, Margaret said quietly. I know that, Tom said, and realized as he spoke the words that he truly believed them. In the short time he had known Margaret, he had seen her kindness with children, her respectful treatment of Esther, her dignity under difficult circumstances. This was not a woman capable of cold-blooded murder. But that doesn't change our situation. We need a plan. Esther, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. There might be another way. Both Tom and Margaret turned to look at her expectantly. Miss Margaret, you still have that letter, don't you? The one from Dr. Hamilton. Margaret's eyes widened with sudden hope. I'd almost forgotten. Tom, Dr. Hamilton was our family physician for years. After Cornelius died, he came to see me. He told me he had suspected for years that Cornelius was hurting me, but I had always denied it when he asked. What did he say in the letter? Tom asked. He documented every injury he had treated over the years. The broken ribs I claimed came from a fall. The bruises I said were from clumsiness. The concussion I blamed on walking into a door. He wrote it all down, along with his medical opinion that the injuries were consistent with systematic domestic abuse. That's evidence, Tom said excitedly. That could change everything. But how do we get it to the right people without getting caught? Margaret asked. Tom was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then a plan began to form in his mind. Risky, but possibly their only chance. We don't run, he said finally. We make them come to us, but we make sure the whole town is watching when they do. Over the next hour, Tom outlined his plan. It was audacious and dangerous, but it was also their best hope of clearing Margaret's name and exposing the truth about what had really happened in Boston. They would need the help of several townspeople, and they would be gambling everything on the hope that justice could still prevail when the truth was finally told. As dawn approached, Tom realized that his quiet, practical arrangement with Margaret had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. He was no longer just trying to save his ranch. He was fighting for his wife's life and freedom, and somewhere in the process, their business partnership had begun to feel like something much more personal and profound. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Texas horizon when Tom made his final preparations for what would either be Margaret's salvation or their mutual destruction. Either way, the quiet town of Millbrook was about to witness drama unlike anything in its brief history. Chapter 4. Justice in the Desert Sun. The morning sun blazed over Millbrook's main street as Tom rode into town with a determination that surprised even him. His plan was risky, perhaps even foolhardy, but it was their only chance to clear Margaret's name and expose the truth about what had really happened in Boston. Behind him, Margaret and Esther followed in the wagon, both women displaying a calm courage that belied the danger they were walking into. Tom's first stop was the office of Dr. Morgan, the town's physician and one of its most respected citizens. The doctor listened with growing indignation as Tom and Margaret explained the situation, particularly when Margaret showed him Dr. Hamilton's letter documenting years of systematic abuse. "This is outrageous," Dr. Morgan declared, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he read the detailed medical evidence. "Any physician worth his salt can see that these injuries could only have come from deliberate violence. The pattern is unmistakable. The question is, will anyone listen?" Tom asked. "The Richardson family has money and influence. They've managed to paint Margaret as a cold-blooded killer." Dr. Morgan removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully. "Money and influence carry weight in Boston, Tom, but this is Texas. Out here, we tend to judge people by their actions, not their bank accounts. And we don't take kindly to men who hurt women." Their next stop was the church, where Reverend Matthews was preparing for the morning service. The elderly preacher's face grew grave as he listened to their story, but his expression also hardened with righteous anger. "I've seen enough of the world to know that evil often wears a respectable face," he said quietly. "If what you're telling me is true, and I believe it is, then justice must be served. But more than that, the truth must be told. This young woman has suffered enough." By mid-morning, word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The federal marshals had made no attempt to hide their presence, questioning townspeople about Margaret and making it clear that they intended to arrest her. But Tom's counter-strategy was already taking effect. Dr. Morgan had shared his medical opinion with several prominent citizens, while Reverend Matthews had spoken with the church elders about the moral implications of the case. The confrontation came at exactly noon, when Marshal William Garrett and his 2 deputies approached the Sullivan Ranch. Tom had anticipated this timing. Noon was when the town was at its busiest, with people conducting business, shopping and socializing on the main street. It was also when his plan would have the greatest impact, but the marshals didn't find Margaret at the ranch. Instead, they found a note directing them to the town square, where Margaret would be waiting to surrender herself, but only in front of the entire community, where her story could be heard by everyone. When the marshals arrived at the town square, they found nearly the entire population of Millbrook assembled. Margaret stood on the steps of the church, flanked by Tom on one side and Reverend Matthews on the other. Dr. Morgan stood nearby, holding Dr. Hamilton's letter and his own medical assessment. Marshal Garrett, a stern-faced man in his 50s with silver hair and cold blue eyes, dismounted from his horse and approached the crowd. His two deputies remained mounted, hands resting near their weapons, clearly prepared for trouble. "Margaret Hartwell Richardson," Garrett called out in a voice that carried authority and menace. "You are under arrest for the murder of Cornelius Richardson and theft of his assets. You will come with us immediately." Instead of responding with fear, Margaret stepped forward with the same dignity she had shown throughout her ordeal. But now, surrounded by the people of Millbrook, she seemed to draw strength from their support. "Before I go anywhere," Margaret said in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the square, "these people have the right to hear the truth about what happened in Boston." You'll have your chance to tell your lies in court," Garrett replied harshly. "Now come along peacefully, or we'll take you by force." "Marshal," Dr. Morgan interrupted, stepping forward with professional authority, "as a physician, I have evidence that bears directly on this case. Evidence that suggests Mrs. Sullivan, that's her legal name now, was defending herself against systematic abuse." Garrett's expression didn't change. "I don't care what frontier quack medicine you practice out here, Doctor. This woman is a wanted fugitive, and I'm taking her back to Boston to stand trial." The crowd stirred restlessly at Garrett's dismissive tone. Frontier communities were tight-knit by necessity, and insulting one of their own, especially someone as respected as Dr. Morgan, was a serious mistake. Tom seized the moment. "Marshal, you seem awfully eager to prevent people from hearing the evidence. If you're so confident in your case, what are you afraid of?" "I'm not afraid of anything, boy," Garrett snapped, "but I won't stand here and listen to fabricated stories designed to help a murderess escape justice." "Then let's examine the facts," Reverend Matthews said, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. "Margaret, tell these people what really happened." For the next 20 minutes, Margaret recounted her story to the assembled crowd. She spoke without self-pity or dramatic flourishes, simply stating the facts of her marriage to Cornelius Richardson and the years of abuse she had endured. When she described the final, fatal confrontation, her voice remained steady, though tears streamed down her face. "I never intended to kill him," she concluded. "I only wanted him to stop hurting me. When he came at me that last time, I truly believed he was going to kill me. The knife. It was the only thing within reach." Dr. Morgan then read portions of Dr. Hamilton's letter, describing the pattern of injuries he had documented over the years. His own medical opinion, based on his examination of Margaret, corroborated the evidence of long-term physical abuse. The crowd's mood had shifted dramatically during Margaret's testimony. The initial curiosity had given way to sympathy, then to anger, not at Margaret, but at the system that had failed to protect her and was now seeking to punish her for defending herself. Marshal Garrett, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, decided to reassert his authority. "Enough of this theater," he declared. "Mrs. Richardson, you're coming with us now." He nodded to his deputies, who dismounted and started toward Margaret. But before they could reach her, Tom stepped into their path. "She's not Mrs. Richardson anymore," Tom said firmly. "She's Margaret Sullivan, and she's under the protection of her husband and this community." "Oh, stand aside, Sullivan," Garrett warned. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." "The only thing hard here is watching innocent people get railroaded by corrupt officials," Tom replied. The crowd murmured agreement, and several men stepped forward to stand beside Tom. What happened next surprised everyone, including Tom. Esther Washington, the elderly black woman who had been Margaret's protector and companion, walked slowly toward Marshall Garrett. Despite her age and small stature, there was something in her bearing that commanded attention. "Marshall," she said in a voice that carried surprising authority, "before you take Miss Margaret anywhere, there's something you need to know about me." Garrett frowned impatiently. "What could you possibly have to do with this, old woman?" Esther reached into her satchel and withdrew a folded document. "My name is Esther Washington, and I was born a slave on the Richardson plantation in South Carolina in 1820. I was sold to the Richardson family in Boston when I was 15 years old, and I spent the next 40 years in their service." She handed the document to Dr. Morgan, who unfolded it and examined it carefully. "This appears to be a bill of sale," he announced to the crowd. "And what looks like a freedom certificate?" "That's right," Esther continued. "I was freed by Cornelius Richardson's grandfather in 1875, but I chose to stay with the family. I saw 3 generations of Richardson men, and I can tell you that cruelty runs in their blood like a disease." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on Esther's every word. "I watched Cornelius grow from a spoiled boy into a violent man. I saw what he did to his first wife, beat her so badly she lost 3 babies before they were born. When she finally died of her injuries, the family called it pneumonia." Marshall Garrett's face was growing red with anger and perhaps embarrassment. "This is all hearsay and speculation." "No, sir, it's not," Esther interrupted firmly, "because I kept records. Every beating, every accident, every visit from the doctor, I wrote it all down, and I kept every piece of evidence I could find." She reached into her satchel again and withdrew a thick bundle of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be personal correspondence. 40 years of evidence, Marshall. 40 years of documented abuse by the Richardson family, not just against their wives, but against servants, business partners, and anyone else they thought they could control. Dr. Morgan took the bundle from Esther and began examining its contents, his expression growing more shocked with each page. "Good God," he breathed. This is systematic documentation of decades of criminal behavior, including," Esther added with quiet satisfaction, "several letters from Cornelius to his brother, bragging about how he intended to break Miss Margaret completely and how much he enjoyed hurting her." The effect on the crowd was electric. Men who had initially been curious spectators were now openly angry, while the women present looked horrified and sympathetic. Marshall Garrett found himself facing not just an uncooperative fugitive, but an entire community united against what they now clearly saw as an injustice. But it was Sheriff Morrison who delivered the final blow to Garrett's authority. The local lawman had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, but now he stepped forward with official purpose. "Marshall Garrett," Morrison said formally, "based on the evidence presented here today, I have reasonable cause to believe that Mrs. Margaret Sullivan acted in self-defense when she killed Cornelius Richardson. As the duly elected sheriff of this county, I'm placing her under my protection pending a proper investigation of these charges." Garrett's face was now purple with rage. "You have no jurisdiction in this matter, Sheriff. This is a federal case." "Actually," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, "the sheriff is quite right." Everyone turned to see a tall, distinguished man in a well-tailored suit approaching the group. He carried himself with unmistakable authority, and even Marshall Garrett seemed to recognize him. "Judge Samuel Harrison." The newcomer identified himself to the crowd. "I'm the territorial judge for this district, and I happened to be in the area when word reached me of these proceedings." Judge Harrison walked directly to Dr. Morgan and examined the evidence Esther had provided. After several minutes of careful study, he looked up with a grave expression. "Marshall Garrett," he said formally, "I'm issuing a temporary injunction preventing the removal of Mrs. Sullivan from this territory until a full review of this evidence can be conducted. The documentation presented here raises serious questions about the validity of the charges against her. "You can't do this," Garrett protested. "I have federal warrants, which may have been obtained through fraud or suppression of evidence," Judge Harrison interrupted. "Mrs. Washington's documentation suggests a pattern of abuse and corruption that goes far beyond this single case. I'm ordering a full investigation to be conducted by federal authorities other than yourself." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Margaret, who had stood throughout the ordeal with remarkable composure, finally allowed herself to collapse into Tom's arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he announced, "I'm issuing warrants for the arrest of several members of the Richardson family, based on the evidence of conspiracy to obstruct justice and filing false charges. Marshal Garrett, you will accompany me back to Austin to explain your role in this matter." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Margaret and Tom to offer their congratulations and support. Mrs. Henderson apologized for her initial coldness, while the Jameson brothers sheepishly admitted that they had misjudged her character entirely. Dr. Morgan shook hands with both Tom and Margaret. "I'll be sending copies of all this evidence to medical colleagues in Boston," he promised. "The Richardson family's influence may protect them from some consequences, but their reputation will never recover from this exposure." Reverend Matthews embraced Margaret warmly. "Welcome to our community, Mrs. Sullivan. I think you'll find that Millbrook is a place where people are judged by their character, not their past." As the sun began to set over the Texas landscape, Tom and Margaret stood together on the steps of their church, surrounded by their new community and secure in the knowledge that the truth had finally prevailed. Their marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, had been tested by crisis and forged into something much stronger. "What happens now?" Margaret asked as they prepared to return to the ranch. "Now we build the life we want," Tom replied, taking her hand. "Together." Esther Washington, gathering her precious documentation, smiled as she watched the young couple. She had spent decades protecting the evidence that would eventually bring justice, and now she had lived to see that justice served. 6 months later, the Richardson family's empire had crumbled under the weight of the evidence Esther had preserved. Several family members faced criminal charges, and their influence in Boston society was completely destroyed. Margaret received a formal pardon from the territorial governor, and the charges against her were permanently dropped. The Sullivan Ranch thrived under the partnership of Tom and Margaret, who proved to be not just compatible spouses, but effective business partners. Margaret's education and Tom's practical knowledge combined to create one of the most successful operations in the county. But perhaps more importantly, their story became legend in Millbrook and beyond, a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can overcome the greatest challenges, and that the truth, no matter how long suppressed, will eventually find a way to shine through. Their wedding night had indeed shocked the whole town, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of witnessing the humiliation of a desperate man and an unwanted woman, the people of Millbrook had seen the beginning of a love story that would inspire them for generations to come. And if you've been moved by this incredible story of courage, love, and justice triumphing over corruption and abuse, then show your support by hitting that like button, subscribing to our channel for more amazing true stories from the American frontier, and ringing that notification bell so you never miss our latest content. Margaret and Tom Sullivan's story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the most unexpected beginnings, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, is always worth the risk. Thanks for joining us for this remarkable tale from the Old West, and we'll see you in the next story.